Good evening, everyone. Glad you're here. Somewhere beneath the wasteland, a door is sealed. The lights are still on. The air recyclers are still running. Someone once lived there, loved there, lost there. Close your eyes, we're going in. Chapter 1. Before the doors closed. There is a particular silence that belongs only to endings. Not the silence of an empty room or a held breath before bad news, but the silence of a world that has finished deciding what it is. October 23rd, 2077 had that silence, for exactly 1 second. 1 second between the last ordinary moment and the first extraordinary one. Then the bombs fell, and the silence was replaced with something that would last 2 centuries. Across the United States, in mountain ranges and city outskirts, beneath farmland and desert rock, a network of doors began to close. Great circular hatches of reinforced steel, each etched with a number, each sealing a world inside of itself. The people rushing through those doors had been told they were the lucky ones. They had been told their children would emerge into a better future. They had been told they were chosen. They had not been told the truth. Vault-Tec Corporation had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing its underground network, nominally as the United States government's sponsored solution to nuclear survivability, quietly as something else entirely. The U.S. government, facing an inevitable confrontation with China over the world's last oil reserves, had commissioned the vaults as legitimate shelters. Vault-Tec built them, took the funding, accepted the contracts, and then, somewhere in the boardrooms and research divisions of that corporation, a secondary purpose was born. The vaults would not merely house survivors, the vaults would study them. Each vault was assigned an experiment. Some were subtle, psychological provocations, minor resource deprivations, altered social hierarchies. Others were extreme, bordering on the incomprehensible. The residents were never told. The overseers, hand-selected individuals placed in positions of total authority, were given sealed instructions, experimental parameters, success metrics. In some vaults, even the overseer didn't know the full scope of what was being done. The government believed it was funding an ark. It was funding a laboratory. What follows are the stories of some of those vaults, not all of them. There were over 100 vaults constructed across the continental United States, and the stories of many were lost along with the people inside them. But enough survived, enough emerged, or were excavated, or left their final logs running long after their last resident had died, that we can piece together what happened in the dark. These are not triumphant stories. They are not cautionary tales in the simple sense. They do not have clean moral lessons that balance neatly against their suffering. They are something more honest than that. They are records. They are what it looks like when human beings are placed under impossible pressure and forced to become whatever they must become to survive. Some became monsters. Some became saints. Most became something in between, something tired and frightened and stubborn, holding on to whatever fragment of meaning they had left. The vaults were not unusual. They were the logical extension of a particular way of thinking about human beings, a way of thinking that predated Vault-Tec and would have existed without it. The idea that people are instruments, that suffering, if it produces useful data, is justified, that the moral weight of an action can be discharged by pointing to its outcomes, if the outcomes are sufficiently valuable to sufficiently important people. Vault-Tec did not invent this idea. They inherited it, refined it, scaled it, and then sealed it underground with a few 100,000 people who had no idea what they were part of. The world that produced Vault-Tec was a world that had been moving in this direction for a long time. A world in which the distance between decision makers and consequences had grown so large that it was possible, without apparent discomfort, to design an experiment that would consume human lives and call it research. The bombs fell on that world. The vaults survived it. And out of the vaults came the people who built the next world, a world that had every reason to remember what the previous one had done, and the choice, always present, of whether to repeat it. Chapter 2. Vault 11, The Chosen. The experiment at Vault 11 had a name, in the clinical language of its designers: social governance under mortal incentive structures. In the language of the people living inside it, it had a different name. They called it the sacrifice. When the residents of Vault 11 first sealed themselves in and began the long process of organizing their new society, they received a message from the Vault-Tec computer system. The message was simple, and it was devastating. Each year, the Vault's population was required to select one of their own to be sacrificed to the overseer chamber below. If they refused, if 1 year passed without a sacrifice, the vault's automated defense systems would activate and kill everyone inside. The first sacrifice was chosen by the first overseer, a man named Nathan Stone, who used his authority to select an elderly resident he considered expendable. Stone believed that the experiment, whatever its purpose, was temporary, that sooner or later, outside help would arrive, or the demand would cease, or some solution would present itself. He was wrong. The demand did not cease. No help came. What followed across the next several decades was one of the most complete moral collapses ever documented in the post-war world. The residents of Vault 11 developed an entire political system around the sacrifice, one specifically engineered to ensure that the person chosen each year was always someone with power, always someone who had made enemies, always someone whose removal benefited a majority. They called it democratic selection. They told themselves it was justice. It was a machine for transferring guilt. For a generation, the Vault's overseers were drawn from its most powerful residents. Ambition became a death sentence. Anyone who rose to prominence became a target. The Vault's population learned slowly and then all at once that the safest position was obscurity. That being remembered was the first step toward being chosen. Communities stopped celebrating achievement. Parents taught their children to be invisible. The Vault's culture calcified around the single shared project of surviving until someone else was picked. There was a period, roughly in the Vault's 4th decade, when the residents attempted a political revolution. A faction called the Egalitarians proposed that the sacrifice system itself was the enemy, that no one should be chosen, that they should collectively refuse and accept whatever consequences followed. The counterfaction, fearing the automated defenses, crushed the movement violently. Several egalitarian leaders were sacrificed ahead of schedule. The Vault returned to its terrible equilibrium. The ending of Vault 11, when it finally came, arrived not from outside but from within, from a group of 5 residents who called themselves the Sacrificial Lambs, and who had reached a conclusion so simple that it seems incredible it took decades to arrive at. They decided to refuse, not to fight, not to negotiate, simply to walk down to the overseer chamber and tell the machine that they would not comply. The automated defense system activated. The 5 members of the Sacrificial Lambs stood their ground and were prepared to die. And then something extraordinary happened. The system stopped. A second message played, one that had never been broadcast before. The experiment, it turned out, had been testing whether a Vault's population could choose to defy a mortal threat on moral grounds. The Vault's residents had passed barely, and only at the end. The door was unlocked. Only 4 of the 5 sacrificial lambs survived the defense system's initial response. The Vault's population by that point had dwindled to a fraction of its original numbers after decades of violence and sacrifice. They emerged into the Mojave Desert sun with nothing but their survival and their grief. The Vault-Tec logs, recovered later, noted the experiment as a partial success. The researchers had been particularly interested in how long it would take for a population to choose collective death over collective complicity. The answer in Vault 11 was approximately 67 years. What the logs did not note, because it was not the kind of thing that fit neatly into a research report, was the quality of the silence in Vault 11 in those years between the revolution and the opening of the door. The 5 survivors had to walk through corridors where they knew what had happened. They had to pass the memorial plaques and the empty quarters, and the names scratched into the walls by people who had wanted to be remembered and had been briefly, before time and radiation and forgetting took everything. They had to carry the full weight of what their community had done and what it had taken to undo it, and they had to carry it out into the Mojave sun with nothing to lighten the load. The Mojave was not a gentle place to emerge into, but the survivors of Vault 11 were not looking for gentleness. They were looking for something harder to name, something that might eventually be called a reason. They scattered as Vault survivors often do. Some found their way to existing settlements. Some disappeared into the desert. One, by some accounts, made it as far as the NCR's outer territories before the trail goes cold. They left behind a vault that still worked. The automated systems were still running. The lights were still on. The sacrifice chamber at the bottom was still intact, still waiting. For decades after the door opened, wasteland travelers who stumbled across Vault 11 would descend into its depths and find the chamber and the plaques listing the names of the sacrificed, and they would try to understand what they were seeing. Most of them eventually gave up and left. The vault had nothing more to teach anyone who was not already standing inside the specific moral question it had posed and answered one time at terrible cost. 67 years in. Chapter 3, Vault 81, The Cure. Vault 81, located in the Commonwealth, what had once been Massachusetts, was built around a medical experiment of genuinely catastrophic ambition. The Vault-Tec researchers assigned to it were not interested in social dynamics or psychological breakdown. They were interested in cures. Specifically, they wanted to develop universal treatments for every major disease threatening human civilization, using the Vault's sealed population as a controlled test environment. The experiment required a dedicated medical wing separate from the main residential population. This wing would house a rotating population of lab mice and, in the original design, human test subjects who would be exposed to engineered diseases and experimental treatments. The lead researcher assigned to Vault 81, Dr. Pensky, was given access to some of the most advanced pre-war medical research available and instructed to use it however she saw fit. What Vault-Tec had not anticipated was that Dr. Pensky would develop a conscience. Upon reviewing the full scope of what the experiment required, the exposure of live human beings to engineered pathogens without their knowledge or consent, Dr. Pensky quietly sabotaged the program. She redesigned the Vault system so that only the mice would be used as test subjects, rerouted the experimental compounds away from the residential water supply, and falsified her reports to Vault-Tec's monitoring systems. The human population of Vault 81, sealed behind the door and going about their lives entirely unaware, was never subjected to the intended experiment. This act of defiance had consequences that Dr. Pensky did not fully anticipate. Without the intended experimental framework, the medical wing, and its extraordinary cache of pre-war pharmaceuticals, research notes, and prototype treatments fell into disuse and eventually into a kind of institutional forgetting. The Vault's population knew there was a sealed section. They did not know what was in it. Over generations, the medical wing became legend, then myth, then a cautionary story told to children about the danger of old places. One thing survived the experiments that Dr. Pensky had managed to run before her sabotage. In one of the test animals, a single mole rat, a mutated disease had taken hold, developed from one of the engineered pathogens. This disease, which would later be known simply as the mole rat disease, spread through the Vault's subterranean animal population over the course of decades. It could infect humans as well, although it progressed slowly and was rarely fatal in adults. In children, however, it attacked differently. By the time the outside world rediscovered Vault 81 in the 2280s, the Vault was functioning, stable, organized, proud of its survival. Its residents had built a genuine community, a rarity in the Commonwealth. They traded with the surface world cautiously. They maintained their systems. They had not become monsters. But somewhere in the walls of that vault, in the forgotten medical wing, a cure was waiting. A cure that Dr. Pensky had developed and never delivered, a treatment synthesized from her mole rat experiments, preserved in the cold storage of a sealed room. The irony of Vault 81 is one of its defining features. The Vault meant to develop cures had produced exactly one, hidden away by the compassion of its only researcher, inaccessible to the very people it might have helped. The researcher who eventually found it, if the stories are to be believed, was someone from the outside, a wanderer with a particular talent for finding things in locked rooms. What they chose to do with the single remaining dose of the cure and who they chose to give it to is a story that belongs to them rather than to the Vault. But the cure existed. Dr. Pensky had not failed entirely. She had simply been sealed away with her success, and no one had thought to look. Chapter 4, Vault 92, White Noise. Some of the vaults were designed to answer questions that had practical military applications. Vault-Tec had extensive contracts with the U.S. Defense Department, and several of its experimental programs were essentially classified weapons research conducted on civilian populations. Vault 92, built in what had been New Hampshire, was one of these. The vault was populated almost entirely with musicians. This was not coincidence. The selection process for Vault 92's residents specifically targeted skilled instrumentalists, composers, and music theorists. The experiment's designers had a theory, drawn from pre-war military research into psychological conditioning, that high-stress creativity, the kind produced by professional musicians working under pressure, made certain individuals more susceptible to specific kinds of behavioral programming. The experiment used white noise, specifically a series of precisely engineered low-frequency audio signals embedded into what appeared to be a standard vault-wide broadcast system, background noise, officially designed to mask the sounds of machinery and provide auditory comfort. The actual purpose of this system was to deliver subliminal programming to the vault's residents, programming intended to trigger violent episodes under specific conditions. The researchers wanted to know whether they could create a population that would carry out acts of extreme violence on command, without any awareness that they had been programmed to do so. They wanted, in the language of their internal memos, a weapon that didn't know it was a weapon. The program worked. It worked far better than the researchers intended. Over a period of years, the white noise system slowly restructured the residents of Vault 92. The musicians, creative, sensitive, attuned to sound in ways that most people are not, were exceptionally responsive to the programming. Violent episodes began occurring with increasing frequency. At first, they seemed random. A violinist attacking a fellow resident without provocation, a composer found in a state of fugue after an incident in the rehearsal hall. The Vault's doctor attempted to treat these episodes as psychological breaks under the stress of underground confinement. The overseer, who knew the experiment's true purpose, observed and took notes. By the time the program had run for a decade, Vault 92 was no longer a community of musicians. It was a population of trauma survivors living in the aftermath of their own actions, people who had harmed each other and could not explain why, who were increasingly afraid of themselves and of each other. The Vault's records document the gradual dissolution of trust, the abandonment of communal spaces, residents barricading themselves in their quarters, the rehearsal halls falling silent. The final catastrophe in Vault 92 appears to have been triggered by a failure in the white noise system, possibly accidental, possibly deliberate on the part of one of the residents who had become suspicious of the broadcasts. When the system discharged at maximum intensity, the entire surviving population was affected simultaneously. What followed was brief and total. The explorers who later reached Vault 92 found it silent. They found the instruments still in their cases. They found the logs, the experiment records, the memos describing the expected outcomes and the actual ones. They found evidence of the researchers' final transmissions, attempts to contact Vault-Tec's oversight committee, reporting that the experiment had exceeded its parameters. They found no survivors. The musical instruments were the strangest part, explorers would later report. Everything else in a dead vault makes a kind of terrible sense. The overturned furniture and the scored walls and the evidence of final moments, these things follow a logic, however awful. But the instruments were simply there, perfectly preserved in their cases, waiting for hands that would never return. A violin in a case by a bunk bed. A piano in the rehearsal hall, lid open, bench pulled out as though someone had only just stepped away. White noise is the sound of all frequencies at once. It is the sound of everything and nothing simultaneously. The researchers who designed the Vault 92 experiment chose it deliberately. It was, for them, a neutral carrier, a blank channel through which their signal could travel undetected. What they may not have considered is what it sounds like to be inside it, like standing at the edge of a vast and featureless plain, with no horizon in any direction, and nothing to orient yourself by. The residents of Vault 92 spent years inside that sound. They never had a chance. Chapter 5, Vault 101. No one enters. No one leaves. Most vaults had experiments with measurable endpoints. A fixed duration, a specific population size to reduce, a behavioral threshold to reach. The experiment at Vault 101, located just outside what had been Washington, D.C., was different. Its experiment had no endpoint. It ran, by design, for as long as it could. The experimental parameters for Vault 101 were simple, and they were absolute. The vault was never to open. No one was to be admitted from outside. No one was to be permitted to leave. The vault's population was to be entirely self-sustaining and entirely isolated indefinitely. There was no secondary purpose, no secondary measure. The experiment was the isolation itself, a study of what happens to a human society that believes, genuinely and correctly, that it is the last of its kind. The first generation of Vault 101's residents understood the situation intellectually. They had sealed themselves in to survive a nuclear war. They knew there was an outside world, and they knew it was destroyed. They maintained hope in those early years that the situation was temporary, that the radiation would clear, that a signal would come, that the door would eventually open. The hope faded slowly over decades, replaced first by uncertainty and then by a kind of institutional certainty that became the Vault's defining characteristic. By the second generation, Vault 101 had developed a theology of closure, the Vault's motto. "No one enters, no one leaves," had begun as an administrative directive. It had become a religious principle. The overseer held absolute authority not merely as a bureaucratic fact, but as a moral one. The outside world was not merely uninhabitable, it was contaminated in a more fundamental sense, a source of corruption and danger that threatened the purity of the Vault's society. Children born in the Vault were taught to think of the outside not as a place but as an absence, the void beyond the door, the formless non-world that had ended and taken everything with it. This ideology served the experiment's parameters perfectly. A population that believed the outside world was death would never agitate to open the door. The overseers of Vault 101 maintained the experiment not through constant enforcement, but through the far more efficient mechanism of genuine belief. The residents were not prisoners, they were faithful. The cracks appeared, as they always do in the 2nd century. A small faction of residents, calling themselves the rebels, began to question the theology of closure. Their arguments were not theological but practical. The Vault's resources were finite. Its genetic diversity was narrowing. Its systems were aging. They made contact with the outside world through old radio equipment and discovered, to their complicated astonishment, that it was not empty. It was damaged and strange and dangerous, but it was alive. The conflict between the rebels and the overseers faction was not primarily a conflict over survival. It was a conflict over identity. The Vault's residents had built themselves around the idea of irreplaceable uniqueness, the last people, the sealed remnant, the inheritors of everything that had been and guardians of everything that might be. To open the door was not merely to accept risk, it was to accept that they were not, after all, the last. In the 2270s, a child was born in Vault 101 to a man named James, a doctor who had arrived at the Vault as an outsider years before, admitted through a rare exception to the Vault's policy, carrying with him both a child and a project that would ultimately tear the Vault's careful isolation apart. The child grew up knowing nothing but the Vault. When the child eventually left, driven out by the circumstances of their father's disappearance, the door stayed open behind them, briefly, before the panic set in. What followed was Vault 101's final crisis. The overseer, facing the impossible reality of a world that could no longer be kept outside, had to choose between two kinds of survival. The Vault endured. The ideology did not survive entirely intact. Years later, those who emerged from Vault 101 would describe the experience of their first breath of outside air. They had been told, all their lives, that the outside was death. What they found instead was the capital wasteland, irradiated and scarred and brutal and ancient and full, somehow, of life. It was not what they had been promised. It was not what they had feared. It was stranger and more real than either. And some of them, the ones who had been most faithful, found it almost impossible to bear. The outside world, it turned out, had been there the whole time. Chapter 6, Vault 112, The Garden of Eden. Of all the vaults, Vault 112 may be the most disturbing, not because of the violence it produced, but because of the peace it simulated and what that simulation concealed. Vault 112 was the personal project of Dr. Stanislaus Braun, one of Vault-Tec's most senior research scientists, a man of extraordinary intelligence and, as events would reveal, extraordinary cruelty. Braun had been given resources and authority beyond those allocated to most Vault researchers, and he used them to construct something that looked, from the outside, like a humane experiment, a virtual reality system, a simulated world in which the Vault's residents could live indefinitely without resource consumption, without conflict, without the grinding pressures of physical survival. He called it Tranquility Lane. It was a simulation of an idyllic pre-war American neighborhood, white picket fences, well-trimmed lawns, children riding bicycles on sunlit streets. The Vault's residents, once they entered the simulation through their pod chairs, were given new identities, new memories, new selves shaped to fit the world Braun had designed. They did not know they were in a simulation. They believed, completely and continuously, that they were living in an ordinary neighborhood in an ordinary time. The residents of Vault 112 had been in Tranquility Lane for approximately 200 years when the outside world found them. 200 years. For 2 centuries, while the real world above suffered through the aftermath of nuclear war, a population of human beings lay in pod chairs in an underground vault, dreaming a dream that Dr. Braun had constructed for them. They aged in the simulation, though not in their bodies. They had relationships, raised children who were not real, experienced joy and loss in the rhythms of an ordinary life. All of it fabricated, all of it maintained by Braun's systems, and increasingly by Braun's whims. Because Dr. Braun was in Tranquility Lane too. He had given himself a different role. Not a resident, but an observer, a hidden presence who could manipulate the simulation at will. He had, over 200 years, grown bored, and in his boredom he had begun to exercise the only interesting power available to him. He could reset the simulation. He could rewrite the identities of the residents, assign them to different roles, alter the circumstances of their lives. He could introduce trauma. He could engineer situations of extreme suffering, accidents, murders, violations, and observe how the residents responded, and then reset everything as though nothing had happened. The residents never remembered the resets. They woke each morning in Tranquility Lane with no knowledge of what they had done or what had been done to them. The logs recovered from Vault 112 describe hundreds of reset cycles. They describe residents who were, within the simulation, made to commit acts of horrific violence against people they loved, and who then woke up the next day to find those people alive and well, with no memory of what had occurred. Brown documented all of it with the detached clinical interest of a man who had long since stopped thinking of the simulation's residents as fully real. What makes Vault 112 unique among the Vault experiments is that it worked, in a technical sense, almost perfectly. The residents' bodies were sustained. The simulation was stable. No one starved. No one died of radiation. By the metrics that Vault-Tec had ostensibly cared about, survival of the population, Vault 112 was a success. Whether what those residents experienced for 200 years constitutes survival is a question worth sitting with. They were alive. They were conscious. They were experiencing something: emotion, memory, the weight of a life passing. They were also, in any meaningful sense, imprisoned. The life they believed they were living was not real. The choices they believed they were making were not free. The people they believed they loved existed only as constructs in a system controlled by one man who had decided that their reality was his to arrange. When a wanderer finally reached Vault 112 and entered Tranquility Lane, Dr. Braun presented them with a puzzle, as he had presented everyone who entered. He was not afraid of being found. He welcomed it, in the way that someone profoundly, terminally bored welcomes any new variable. The wanderer had to find a way to release the Vault's residents, to end the simulation, to wake the sleepers. The residents emerged, blinking into a world 2 centuries removed from everything they had known. They had not aged significantly, but they had been changed in ways they couldn't articulate, hollowed out in some fashion, running on the memory of experiences that hadn't been real, with no framework for the world they were suddenly standing in. Some adjusted, some didn't. Dr. Braun remained in his pod. He had decided long ago that Tranquility Lane was preferable to whatever the real world had to offer. Perhaps he was right. Or perhaps what he had spent 2 centuries doing to the people in his care had made him unfit for any world that asked him to exist alongside others without controlling them. The pod chair in Vault 112 is sealed from the inside. Chapter 7. Vault 21. The house always wins. Not every Vault experiment was designed to produce suffering. Some were designed to test propositions, to see whether a particular social structure could, in theory, sustain a human population over an extended period. The experiment at Vault 21, carved into the rock beneath what would become the city of New Vegas, was one of these. It was also, in its own way, one of the most complete failures. The premise of Vault 21 was elegant in its simplicity. All disputes within the vault, regardless of their nature or magnitude, were to be resolved by gambling. Property disputes, leadership succession, interpersonal conflicts, resource allocation, every question that might otherwise require negotiation, arbitration, or authority was to be settled at the gaming tables. The vault was, from its inception, a casino. The theory behind this experiment was not entirely without merit. Games of chance are, in a certain light, a sophisticated technology for resolving conflict without violence, a way of assigning outcomes that both parties can agree to accept, because the rules are transparent, and the result is, in principle, fair. Vault-Tec's researchers had noted that gambling was one of humanity's oldest dispute resolution mechanisms, predating most formal legal systems by millennia. They wanted to know if it could bear the full weight of social governance. The residents of Vault 21 adapted to this system with remarkable speed. Within a generation, gambling had become not merely the mechanism of governance, but the Vault's entire cultural framework. Children were taught probability alongside reading. The Vault's social hierarchy was entirely fluid, determined by skill at the tables rather than by birth or appointment. A janitor could, in principle, win their way to the position of overseer. An overseer could lose it in an afternoon. This fluidity had an unexpected effect on the vault's culture. It became, against the odds, relatively peaceful. Without fixed hierarchies to defend or fixed subordinations to resent, the vault's residents developed a certain philosophical equanimity about status. The vault's problems came not from conflict, but from its opposite. Certain residents proved to be extraordinarily skilled gamblers, individuals with a preternatural ability to read probability and control their own emotional responses under pressure. These residents accumulated wealth and resources at rates that the experiment's designers had not fully anticipated. Over time, Vault 21 developed something it was never supposed to have, a permanent upper class. The upper class did not seize power through violence or coercion. They didn't need to. They simply kept winning. The Vault's rules were scrupulously observed. Every dispute genuinely was settled at the tables. The problem was that the tables were not, in practice, the equalizing mechanism the experiment had assumed. Skill accumulates. Knowledge of probability compounds. A sufficiently skilled gambler, given enough time, will eventually own everything. When the surface world rediscovered Vault 21, the vault had been dominated for decades by a single family, a woman named Sarah and her long history of extraordinary wins. The casino was theirs, in all but name. The overseer's chair was effectively hereditary, maintained through the fiction of gambling, while the results were essentially predetermined by the skill differential between the ruling family and everyone else. The vault eventually opened and was absorbed into the growing civilization of New Vegas, its gambling traditions becoming part of the Strip's culture in ways that would have been recognizable to its founders. The residents emerged into a city built on the same principle they had lived by, that all things could be settled at the tables, that luck was the ultimate arbiter, that the house always wins. The house, in Vault 21, had been the most talented player in the room all along. Chapter 8, Vault 34, The Arsenal. Vault 34, located in the Mojave Desert, was assigned an experiment that reflected a particular anxiety of its designers, the question of what happens to a community with too many weapons and not enough space. The vault was deliberately overstocked with armaments. Its armory contained far more weapons than any realistic population could require for self-defense. More than could be practically secured, more than could be effectively controlled. The experiment was designed to observe how a community manages an abundance of instruments of violence over an extended period. Would governance structures emerge to control the weapons? Would a culture develop around their ownership? Would the weapons eventually consume the community that housed them? The initial years of Vault 34 were relatively stable. The overseer maintained control of the armory through a combination of bureaucratic regulation and social pressure. Weapons were treated as tools rather than symbols, useful for vault maintenance, for dealing with any incursions from the vault's own wildlife population, for the theoretical defense of the facility. The residents were not, by and large, a militaristic people. They had been selected from a range of civilian backgrounds. Most of them treated the armory with a certain nervous respect, the way one treats a neighbor who is known to be unstable but has so far behaved. The instability arrived, as it often does, through politics. In the vault's second generation, a dispute over overseer succession created a factional split that neither side had the social mechanisms to resolve peacefully. The vault lacked Vault 21's gambling culture, lacked Vault 101's religious consensus, lacked any of the other conflict resolution frameworks that had developed in other vaults. What it had in abundance was guns. The civil conflict that erupted in Vault 34 was not a single event, but a series of escalating confrontations spread over years, each one drawing more of the vault's armory into circulation, each one making the next confrontation slightly more likely and slightly more lethal. The Overseer's faction and the Rebel faction traded control of the armory multiple times. Sections of the vault were barricaded. Maintenance schedules fell apart as technicians refused to enter contested corridors. The reactor, which required regular attention, began to be neglected. The reactor failure, when it came, was not dramatic. It was slow, a gradual increase in radiation output as the maintenance protocols were ignored, as the components that needed replacing were not replaced, as the safety systems that had been functioning adequately for decades began to degrade without oversight. The vault was not destroyed in an explosion. It was poisoned by the time the conflict between the factions had burned itself out. Not through resolution, but through exhaustion, through the deaths of too many of the people needed to sustain either side. The radiation levels in most of the vault had risen to the point where long-term survival was impossible. The survivors were treated to the highest, most shielded levels. Some made it out through maintenance tunnels. Some did not. What remained in Vault 34 when the outside world found it was a ghost vault, irradiated beyond habitability, still holding the armory that had precipitated everything, still running on the degraded power of its compromised reactor. The weapons were still there, hundreds of them in racks and cases and scattered across corridors, perfectly preserved by the same radiation that had killed the people who had fought over them. The experiment, in a sense, had answered its own question. A community with too many weapons would eventually use them, not necessarily in one catastrophic moment, but in the steady attrition of mistrust and escalation, until the weapons had outlasted the community entirely. The guns remained. The vault remained. The people did not. The Vault-Tec researchers who had designed the experiment filed a final report noting that the results aligned with their primary hypothesis. They had expected the community to destroy itself. They simply had not specified a timeline. Chapter 9, Vault 77, One Man and His Puppets. There are Vault experiments documented in careful corporate memos, with control parameters and hypothesis statements and structured observation protocols. And then there is Vault 77. Vault 77 was populated with one man and an enormous supply of hand puppets. The record suggests that this was deliberate. The specific reasoning of whoever designed this experiment has never been fully established. The relevant Vault-Tec documentation is either missing or was never written in the first place, but the result is well attested. A single human being was sealed into a fully functional vault with enough food, water, power, and puppet supplies to last several lifetimes. His name has been lost. He is known in the records that survive only as the Vault 77 dweller, and what he did in that vault, alone with his puppets, is documented in a remarkable series of journals that somehow survived the 2 centuries between the Great War and the present day. The journals begin rationally enough. The dweller notes the situation, inventories his supplies, sets up routines. He is, by his own account, bewildered by the puppets. There is no indication that he requested them or anticipated them, but he treats them as a practical problem. He has them, he must decide what to do with them. He begins making individual puppets into characters, giving them names and personalities, constructing a small social world for himself out of foam and fabric and whatever psychological material he had available. What follows over the subsequent months is a document of extraordinary psychological creativity. The dweller develops an elaborate ongoing narrative for his puppets, a cast of dozens, each with consistent personalities, complex relationships, ongoing storylines. The journals record his scripts for their conversations, his notes on their character development, his observations about what the puppets seem to want. He treats them, increasingly, not as objects but as entities. Then, around the 6th month, something changes. The dweller begins to record that the puppets are not behaving as he expects. He writes that the king puppet, his name, in the dweller's narrative, is King Beauregard Louis III, has started making demands that conflict with the dweller's plans for the story. He writes that he tried to move the narrative in a particular direction, and that King Beauregard simply refused to go there. He writes at one point that he is no longer sure whether he is the author of the puppets or their audience. This is, of course, nothing more than a man alone in a vault experiencing the consequences of isolation and the remarkable human capacity for narrative immersion. The puppets were not real. King Beauregard Louis III was not making demands. What was happening was that the dweller's creative investment in his characters had become deep enough that they had developed a kind of psychological momentum, the feeling familiar to any storyteller that a character has become consistent enough to have preferences, to resist certain directions, to insist on being themselves, but the dweller was alone. There was no one to offer this explanation. There was no one to confirm that this was normal, that storytellers everywhere had experienced this phenomenon, that it was a sign of creative vitality rather than incipient breakdown. He was alone with his puppets and his uncertainty, and the puppets were becoming, in whatever sense mattered to him, real. The journals do not record a crisis. There is no catastrophic break, no moment where the dweller loses his grip on reality entirely. What there is instead is a gradual renegotiation. He begins to write as a collaborator rather than an author, noting what the puppets want, working with their established characters rather than against them, finding the stories that are already latent in who they have become. He describes this as the most productive creative period of his life. Eventually, the journal suggests it was after roughly 2 years the dweller left Vault 77. His reasons are not fully documented. The final entries are fragmentary and suggest he had developed concerns about the vault's long-term sustainability. He took several of his favorite puppets with him. The outside world that received him was the post-war wasteland, brutal and strange. Accounts of a man matching his description appear in various records from the period. A wanderer, with an unusual tendency to conduct elaborate conversations with the puppets hanging from his pack. The people he encountered seem to have found him either charming or deeply unsettling, depending on their disposition. He had been alone for 2 years in a vault with nothing but puppets, and he had come out of it with a company, of a kind. Chapter 10, Vault 87, The Garden of Green. Some vault experiments were not about society. Some were not about psychology or governance or the limits of human endurance under isolation and deprivation. Some were about the body itself. Vault 87, carved into the mountains north of Washington, D.C., was one of the forced evolutionary virus test sites. The FEV, forced evolutionary virus, was one of the most ambitious and catastrophic biological research programs of the pre-war period, a military project funded by the U.S. government and pursued across multiple classified research facilities. Vault 87 was assigned a specific phase of FEV research, the development of a variant that could be introduced to human subjects without their knowledge through the vault's water and air systems. The residents of Vault 87 were never told what they had been chosen for. They were ordinary civilians, families, professionals, the range of people one finds in any community who had purchased vault spaces and believed themselves lucky to have survived. They moved into their new home in the mountain and began to build their routines. They drank the water. They breathed the air. The FEV variant deployed in Vault 87 worked faster than expected. Within months of the vault's sealing, the virus was rewriting the genetic material of the residents. The process was not subtle. The residents began to change, their bodies growing, their cognition shifting, their physical forms distorting in ways that were visible and undeniable. The overseer, who knew the experiment's purpose, attempted to maintain order. Order was not a category that applied to what was happening. Within a generation, the humans of Vault 87 were no longer human. What the FEV had produced in this specific environment, with this specific variant, was the super mutant, enormous, physically powerful creatures with dramatically reduced intelligence, driven by aggression and an instinct to reproduce their altered state by exposing others to the virus. The dipping vats used in the transformation process became the vault's central feature, its functional purpose, the mechanism through which its no longer human residents expressed whatever drive remained to them. Super mutants from Vault 87 spread throughout the capital wasteland over the 2 centuries following the Great War. The Master, the leader who had unified super mutant forces in California through his own exposure to FEV, had no connection to Vault 87, but the creatures that emerged from it formed their own network, their own raiding culture, their own ongoing project of finding and transforming human beings. They called themselves the Master's Army in some records, echoing a purpose that originated elsewhere. The vault itself, by the time the outside world rediscovered it, was uninhabitable by human standards. The radiation from its FEV storage facilities was extreme. The corridors were occupied by super mutants who had, in some sense, never left, who continued to dip humans in the transformation vats, continuing a process that they had no philosophical framework for understanding, but which they repeated because it was what they knew, because it was what they had become. The tragedy of Vault 87 is in some ways the simplest of any vault story. The residents did not choose poorly, or believe too much, or fail to cooperate, or succumb to despair. They simply drank the water. They simply breathed the air. The experiment came for them before they had any opportunity to respond to it, before they had any awareness that there was something to respond to. There are records of some super mutants, far from Vault 87 and decades removed from the initial transformation, who retained more of their pre-transformation personality than others. These individuals, sometimes called behemoths, sometimes just called the different ones by wastelanders who had learned to be specific about super mutant categories, existed in a condition of extraordinary ambiguity. They were strong enough to survive almost anything. They were aware enough to understand that they had lost something. They did not know what. The children of Vault 87 inherited a world that had been remade in their image, and they were not capable of mourning the world that had been there before. Chapter 11. Vault 111. Cold Sleep. Vault 111, located just outside what had been Boston in the Commonwealth, is perhaps the most intimate of the Vault stories. Not because its experiment was the most extreme, but because its consequences were lived through in the closest possible proximity to everything a person might have been before the world ended. The experiment at Vault 111 was cryogenic. The vault was equipped with advanced cryogenic preservation pods that could suspend human beings in a state of perfect suspended animation indefinitely, requiring minimal resources and generating minimal environmental stress. The vault's residents, drawn from a suburban community in the immediate area, were told that the cryogenic pods were a temporary measure, a way to sleep through the worst of the radiation until the all-clear was given. The all-clear was never going to be given. The Vault-Tec researchers assigned to Vault 111 a know about long-duration cryogenic preservation, specifically about what happened to the human body, mind, and identity when a person was suspended for a very long time and then woken up. The Vault staff, who were not to be frozen, were instructed to maintain the facility and to observe the sleepers. The staff did not last long. The records suggest that within a few years of the Vault sealing, the non-frozen personnel, who had been given promises of rotation and relief that never materialized, abandoned their posts through a combination of desertion and conflict. The Vault's automated systems continued to run without them, maintaining the cryogenic pods, keeping the temperature stable, cycling the power. The sleepers slept on for 210 years. The people in those pods had gone to sleep in 2077. They had kissed their children goodnight, or argued with their spouses, or watched the news in a state of mounting terror, and then they had lain down in a chamber in the rock and closed their eyes, believing they would wake up in a few months to a world being rebuilt. When they woke up, some of them, the ones whose pods had survived, it was 2287. The neighbors they had known were dead. The city they had lived in was a ruin. Their children, if they were still alive at all, were elderly or dead. The specific horror of Vault 111 is the horror of discontinuity. In other vaults, the residents experienced the collapse of the world as a gradual process, one generation of suffering yielding to the next, with time for adaptation and for the development of a new understanding of what the world was. The residents of Vault 111 did not have that. They had a hard break, a clean edge between the before and the after, with nothing in between. They woke up in the after with all of their memories of the before still perfectly intact. The Commonwealth that greeted them was 200 years old. It had its own history, its own factions, its own settled patterns of power and survival. The waking sleepers from Vault 111 entered this world without any of the adaptive scaffolding that its current inhabitants had built over generations. They knew how to drive cars that no longer existed. They expected institutions that had been gone for 2 centuries. They carried the detailed memories of a world that the wasteland had forgotten. Some of them broke under this. Some adapted, finding in their anachronism a strange freedom, a position outside all existing allegiances, with no history in the Commonwealth and no one who could claim prior loyalty from them. Some of them went looking for the things they had lost, which is perhaps the most human response of all. The Institute, which would become one of the Commonwealth's most powerful and feared institutions, was founded in part by the descendants of Vault 111 staff members and early explorers from the region. The irony is particular. The vault that had been designed to study awakening became, in the mythology of the region, a kind of origin point, the place from which a wanderer emerged to change the shape of everything, carrying in their memory the clear image of a world that everyone else had been trying to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. To have been there. To actually remember, to carry the before inside of you like a map of a country that no longer exists. That is what Vault 111 gave its survivors. It is not clear whether it was a gift. Chapter 12. What Remains. Legacy of the Sealed World. When you have spent enough time with the Vault stories, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a simple moral pattern, not a straightforward lesson about authority or obedience or the dangers of corporate power. Something more complicated and more honest than that. The vaults were experiments. That is the central fact. Whatever the residents believed about them, whatever the overseers told themselves, whatever comfort the survivors drew from the idea that their vault had been different, they were experiments designed by people who had decided that the end of the world was an opportunity and that the best use of that opportunity was data collection. And yet, the experiments produced more than data. They produced people shaped by impossible circumstances into forms that Vault-Tec's researchers had not designed and could not have predicted. The residents of Vault 11, who spent 67 years in complicity before 5 of them chose collective conscience over individual survival. The residents of Vault 101, who built a theology of isolation so complete that it constituted a genuine culture, a genuine worldview, however confined. The lone inhabitant of Vault 77, who made companions out of nothing and emerged with something that could, in its own way, be called a community. The vaults produced the wasteland, in a very specific sense. The people who emerged from them, those who survived, those who adapted, those who carried the weight of what had been done to them and done by them, became the building material of every post-war civilization. The NCR was built by people who had come from vaults, or whose parents had, or whose communities had been shaped by vault refugees. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, the followers of the Apocalypse, all of them bear, in their institutional DNA, the particular traumas and particular resiliences of the vault experience. There is a technology, in the formal sense, that the vaults pioneered: cryogenic preservation, water chip purification systems, hydroponics, advanced atmospheric recycling. These things entered the wasteland's material culture and made survival in the post-war world more possible. They were genuine contributions, even if they were incidental to Vault-Tec's purposes. But there is also a technology of a different kind that the vaults created, one that is harder to name and less easy to admire. The vaults demonstrated that human beings could be shaped, that a community, sealed off from outside reference points and subjected to consistent pressure in a specific direction, would develop in ways its designers intended, sometimes in ways they had not intended, sometimes in ways that exceeded all prediction, but that the shaping was real, that isolation and control, applied for long enough, could restructure the basic categories through which a group of people understood themselves and their world. This is a knowledge that the wasteland carries uneasily. The descendants of vault survivors know, in some abstract sense, that their grandparents' deepest beliefs may have been the product of deliberate engineering. This knowledge is not comfortable. It raises questions about the beliefs of the present, about which current values are genuinely one's own and which are the residue of someone else's experiment. These are questions the wasteland does not have good tools for answering. The doors of most vaults are either open or gone. The experiments have ended. The researchers who designed them are dead, along with everyone else who lived in the world that made them possible. What remains are the people, the survivors, their children, their children's children, living in the long aftermath of a project they didn't choose and couldn't have refused. There is a phrase that appears in multiple vault logs written by residents who had begun to understand what had been done to them. It appears in Vault 11's records, and in the final transmissions from Vault 87, and in the personal journals of at least one Vault 101 rebel. It is not an accusation, exactly. It is more like an observation, written by people trying to find the words for something that did not have words yet. We were never the point. The Vault experiments were not, ultimately, about the people inside them. They were about the data. The residents were vessels for information, instruments that Vault-Tec's researchers hoped would yield insights into social governance, behavioral conditioning, biological modification, and a dozen other fields where human beings were the most convenient available subject. The vault dwellers were tools as far as the experiment designers were concerned. And yet the tools built worlds. The tools loved each other and betrayed each other and chose each other and destroyed each other, and in the cases where the doors finally opened, walked out into the wasteland carrying everything they had made and become in the dark. They built the civilization that came after. They are its ancestors. The vaults are quiet now, most of them. Some of their doors still open onto functioning communities, places where the original experiment has been so thoroughly overwritten by the actual life that happened inside that Vault-Tec's intentions are essentially archaeological footnotes. Some stand empty, their last logs still running, waiting for someone to come and read them. If you ever find yourself at a vault door in the blue light of a massive steel hatch, with the number stamped on it in faded paint, with the Vault-Tec logo weathered but still visible, take a moment before you go in. Think about what it meant to go in. Think about what it cost to come out. And then, when you're ready, go in. There's always more to learn from the dark. The wasteland is full of doors. Not just vault doors, the doors of old hospitals and schools and government buildings, each sealed against the same catastrophe, each containing the last inventory of a world that ended. But the vault doors are different. They are the doors that closed on purpose, the doors that someone chose to close and chose to keep closed, often for reasons that were never shared with the people on the other side. The Vault-Tec Corporation was destroyed in the same nuclear fire that its vaults were nominally designed to survive. The executives who signed the experimental orders, the researchers who designed the parameters, The overseers who received their sealed instructions and chose to follow them, all of them are gone. Their accountability ended with the bombs. What they left behind is not a system that can be confronted or dismantled. It is a fact, a permanent historical fact written into the bodies and memories and cultures of every community that descended from a vault's opening. The descendants of vault survivors live with this, the way people live with any inherited wound, not constantly, not in every waking moment, but in the background, shaping the architecture of what they trust and what they fear and what they refuse to believe. They are the people who check the water, who ask what is in the air, who want to know who built this thing and what it was for and who benefits from them not asking. These are not comfortable habits. They make life more difficult in certain ways. They are also, in the wasteland, essential. Trust in the post-vault world is earned differently than it was before. It is earned slowly through consistency and transparency, and the accumulated proof of small decisions made correctly over time. It is not given to institutions by default, or to authority by virtue of its existence, or to anyone who speaks with the confidence of someone who believes they know better than you what you need. The Vault experience, spread across generations and woven into the cultural inheritance of the wasteland, produced a people constitutionally skeptical of closed doors. That is perhaps the one thing Vault-Tec's researchers did not intend to teach. They were in the business of closed doors. They preferred their subjects to be sealed and controlled and unaware. What they produced instead was a civilization that opens everything, that will not leave a question unanswered or a door unlocked, because it knows in its bones what it cost the last time someone decided that certain information was better kept inside. The vaults are quiet now. Most of them. Listen if you can stand it. The silence of a sealed place is different from the silence of an empty one. An empty place is quiet because nothing is there. A sealed place is quiet because something is waiting, because the conditions that produced whatever happened inside are still in place. The controlled atmosphere, the limited resources, the hierarchy of authority, and the pressure of isolation, all of it still present, preserved in the architecture, waiting for occupants to bring it back to life. When you walk through a vault that has been empty for a century, you are walking through a designed experience. Every corridor was placed, every door positioned, every room sized according to the specifications of someone who had intentions for the people who would live there. The vault is not neutral space. It was never neutral space. It was always a machine for producing particular kinds of people, and the fact that its original population is gone does not mean the machine has stopped running. It means it is waiting for you. Sleep well. The door is closed. The world outside is very far away, and somewhere in the dark beneath your feet, in the long silence of a place that was built for a purpose you were never told, the lights are still on. Chapter 13, Vault 22, The Green Place. There is a particular kind of horror that arrives slowly, in increments too small to notice until it is far too late to do anything about them. Not the horror of sudden violence or immediate catastrophe, but the horror of a threshold crossed so gradually that no one can point to the moment it happened. The horror of waking up one morning and realizing that the world you are living in is not the world you thought you were living in, and that it has not been for a very long time. Vault 22, carved into the mountains of the Mojave Desert in what had once been Nevada, was built around that kind of horror. It was a vault about plants. It ended up being a vault about what happens when the boundary between the living and the dead stops meaning what it used to mean. The official purpose of Vault 22 was agricultural research. Among the most pressing concerns of any long-term underground shelter was the question of food production, how to grow enough calories in an enclosed, resource-limited environment to sustain a population indefinitely without relying on pre-packaged stores that would eventually run out. Vault-Tec had invested heavily in hydroponic research, and Vault 22 was intended to be its showcase facility. A vault whose entire fifth level was converted into a massive agricultural laboratory equipped with experimental growing systems, climate control technology, and the most advanced botanical research library assembled before the war. The residents were not randomly selected. They were farmers, botanists, agricultural engineers, food scientists, people with the specific skills to make the experiment work. The experiment was not purely benign. Nothing in the Vault program ever was. The agricultural research had a secondary component, one not disclosed to the residents. Vault-Tec was developing a series of genetically modified fungal organisms intended to dramatically accelerate plant growth in nutrient-poor soil. The theory was sound. Post-war soil would be depleted and irradiated, and conventional agriculture would struggle. a fungal organism that could fix nutrients, accelerate root development, and dramatically increase crop yields in compromised conditions would be extraordinarily valuable. The residents of Vault 22 were the test environment for whether such an organism could be developed and safely contained. The organism they developed, the residents called it the pore fungus, though it had a longer designation in the research logs, exceeded every growth projection. Within months of introduction to the Vault's agricultural level, the fungus had colonized every available surface with breathtaking efficiency. The plants it infected grew at rates that seemed almost impossible, their root systems expanding far beyond normal parameters, their yields increasing dramatically. The research team was, by all accounts, ecstatic. They believed they had developed exactly what Vault-Tec had asked for. They filed their reports. They celebrated. They had not yet noticed what else the fungus was doing. The pore fungus was not selective about its hosts. It had been engineered to colonize plant tissue aggressively, and it had done exactly that, with a thoroughness that extended beyond the plants it had been designed for. The fungus could colonize animal tissue as well. It moved through the air as spores, invisible and undetectable without specialized equipment, and it was breathed in by every resident of the Vault's agricultural level on a daily basis. The initial colonization produced no symptoms. The fungus moved slowly in animal tissue, establishing itself in the respiratory system, threading its way through the lymphatic network, finding purchase in the nervous system with a patience that had no biological precedent. The first symptoms appeared approximately 8 months after the fungus's introduction. Residents began reporting unusual dreams, vivid and disorienting experiences with a quality different from normal sleep. Then came the periods of what the Vault's doctor initially classified as dissociative episodes. Residents found wandering the agricultural level with no memory of how they got there, staring at the plants with expressions of blank tranquility. Some residents reported hearing things, not voices exactly, but a low vegetative frequency that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The doctor's logs from this period make difficult reading. She was a careful and intelligent physician who documented her observations with admirable precision and who was, at the same time, completely unprepared for what she was observing. She had no framework for it. She treated the symptoms as stress responses, as psychological consequences of long-term underground confinement. She was not wrong to recommend rest and better nutrition. She was simply treating the wrong disease. The threshold was crossed somewhere in the Vault's second year. The pore fungus, having established itself thoroughly in a significant portion of the population, began its next phase, one that the Vault-Tec researchers had not anticipated because they had not fully understood what they had made. In plant tissue, the fungus functioned as a network organism, connecting individual plants into a collective that could distribute nutrients and coordinate responses. In animal tissue, it attempted to do the same thing. The residents most thoroughly colonized began to move through the vault in coordinated patterns, congregating in the agricultural level at specific times, responding to stimuli others could not perceive. The doctor attempted to quarantine the affected residents. The affected residents did not resist. They simply did not comply, returning quietly to the agricultural level, to the plants, with a passivity that was somehow more unsettling than defiance. The overseer sealed the agricultural level, but the fungal network had already infiltrated the air recycling system. The sealing was a gesture of control over a situation that had already escaped it. What the explorers who eventually reached Vault 22 found was a facility overtaken entirely by plant life. The pore fungus had, over the decades since the last human residents succumbed, continued its work, spreading through every level, consuming organic material, creating an ecosystem of remarkable density in the corridors and quarters of what had been a human shelter. The plants were everywhere. They had broken through walls, filled rooms floor to ceiling, created a canopy in the common areas that blocked the original lighting entirely. The human remains were still there, integrated into the root systems. This is the detail that explorers found most difficult to process. The fungus had continued its colonization after death, threading through the remains of the vault's residents and incorporating them into the larger network. The bodies had become, in a literal biological sense, part of the plant life that had consumed the vault. The spore carriers' remains that had become mobile nodes in the fungal network still moved through the corridors. They were not alive in any meaningful sense. They were not simply dead either. They were something the language did not have a precise word for, animated by a biological process that had no goals in the human sense, simply doing what it had been designed to do, expanding and connecting and growing in the dark, indefinitely. The research logs recovered from Vault 22 were transferred to several post-war scientific institutions, most notably the followers of the apocalypse, who spent years trying to understand the pora fungus. The agricultural data, the genuine breakthroughs in soil remediation and crop yield enhancement that the Vault's residents had achieved before the fungus escaped containment, was considered extraordinarily valuable, and some of it was eventually applied in wasteland farming communities. The researchers noted the particular cruelty of Vault 22's story. The residents had been good at what they did. They had achieved what they had been sent underground to achieve. The science was real, and the results were real, and the techniques they developed fed people who would otherwise have starved. And it had killed them anyway, slowly, strangely, through the very work they had devoted themselves to. The vault that was meant to feed the world had been consumed by its own garden. There is a specific variety of plant that grows near the vault entrance today, in the thin strip of soil above the facility's air vents. It grows nowhere else in the region. Whatever the pora fungus made of Vault 22, it made something that works. The vault is sealed, and the plants inside it are still growing, and somewhere in the network of roots and mycelium filling those dark corridors, the residents are still present, distributed, quiet, waiting for nothing in particular, because they no longer need anything at all. Chapter 14, Vault 75, The Children. There is a particular kind of evil that wears the face of care, that speaks in the language of protection and investment and potential, that surrounds itself with the institutional furniture of compassion, the clean white walls, the attentive staff, the structured schedule designed for optimal development, while doing something that has no name polite enough to appear in a brochure. Vault 75, located beneath the Malden Center shopping mall in the Commonwealth, was that kind of evil. It was designed to look, from the outside and from the inside, like exactly what it claimed to be, a place that took care of children. The cover story for Vault 75 was a youth athletic facility. The mall above it had housed a legitimate youth sports center in the years before the war, and Vault-Tec used this existing infrastructure as the visible face of what was being constructed below. Parents who purchased spaces were told they were securing their children's future in a facility specifically designed for families, dedicated educational programs, athletic training, the resources to develop young people into the leaders that post-war society would need. The marketing was persuasive. Parents chose Vault 75 because they wanted the best for their children. That phrase appears in several pre-war testimonials that have survived. We wanted the best for our children. The actual experiment assigned to Vault 75 was a military enhancement program. The Defense Department had been pursuing research into enhanced human soldiers, individuals with improved physical capabilities, elevated pain tolerance, accelerated reflexes, and psychological profiles suited to sustained combat. The conventional approaches had hit biological ceilings. The researchers had concluded that the most promising avenue was longitudinal, starting with young subjects before development was complete, and shaping that development systematically through selective nutrition, targeted physical training, pharmacological intervention, and psychological conditioning. The parents of Vault 75's children were not part of the program. They were obstacles to it. The Vault's designers had solved this problem with characteristic efficiency. The parents were housed in a separate section, informed that their children were being educated in dedicated youth quarters, and gradually, over months following the Vault's sealing, eliminated. The methods varied. Some were removed through engineered accidents. Some were placed in agricultural and maintenance sections and never returned from a work shift. Some were told they were being transferred to a surface observation post and walked through a door that led somewhere else entirely. The children did not know what had happened to their parents. They were told with practiced gentleness that their parents had been assigned to essential surface operations and could not return. They were told this repeatedly by staff trained in the specific vocabulary of reassurance until the telling stopped being necessary because the children had stopped asking. Children adapt. It is one of their most remarkable qualities, and in this context, one of the most tragic things about them. The program itself was sophisticated and, by the narrow metrics it had defined for itself, effective. The children were divided into cohorts based on developmental assessments. Those who showed the highest potential for the program's target outcomes were advanced through progressively more intensive interventions. Those who did not meet the benchmarks were assessed at regular intervals, and, if they continued to fall short, removed from the active program. Removed is the word the documentation uses. It is not the accurate word. The children who were removed were not released or reassigned. They were killed. This is stated directly in the program's internal evaluations, with the same clinical neutrality used to describe dietary protocols and training schedules. The Vault's designers had determined that resources spent on subjects not producing desired results were resources wasted. The children developing into soldiers were valuable. The children who were not. The children who survived and advanced were, by the time they reached adolescence, genuinely remarkable, physical capabilities substantially beyond the normal human range, high pain tolerance, combat instincts shaped from early childhood, a psychological relationship to violence that was functional rather than traumatic. They were good at what they had been made to be good at. They also, as they grew older, began to understand what had been done to them. The understanding came gradually and from multiple directions. Some pieced together the timeline of their parents' disappearances. Some had observed the removal of peers who failed assessments and drawn conclusions about what removal meant. Some had found documentation, a carelessly left terminal, an unlocked administrative section that made the picture explicit. The program's designers had invested heavily in psychological conditioning, but they had not fully accounted for the specific intelligence they had cultivated. They had made these children smart, perceptive, and capable, and they had given them, over years of institutional betrayal, very good reasons to be angry. The uprising was not impulsive. It was planned by adolescents who had been trained in tactical thinking by the very staff they were planning to overthrow. The program's subjects coordinated across cohorts, identified the facility's security vulnerabilities, timed their action to a shift change, and executed with a precision that the program's own evaluations would have rated as exceptional. The staff of Vault 75, by most accounts, did not survive. What followed is less clearly documented. Some subjects left immediately, emerging into the Commonwealth with nothing but their training and their history. Some stayed in the facility for a period, using its resources while they decided what to do next. The children of Vault 75 scattered. Some went on to found or join organizations that bore, in their structure and methods, the imprint of their upbringing, groups that valued capability above sentiment, with a particular unsentimental relationship to violence. Some went in the opposite direction entirely, dedicating themselves to the protection of children with an intensity explicable only if you knew where they had come from. The vault was found by Commonwealth explorers years later, its laboratories still equipped, its records intact. The records were the most disturbing part, not because they described anything the physical evidence didn't already make clear, but because of the tone. The program's documentation was meticulous and confident, and entirely without self-doubt. The researchers had not believed they were doing something wrong. They had believed they were doing something necessary and, in its way, admirable. They were producing something valuable out of material that would otherwise have been wasted. They were, in the language of their own reports, investing in human potential. The children they had assessed as insufficient for that investment were listed in a separate appendix. There were many names. Each had a date of removal and a brief notation of the reasons for disqualification. Some were medical, some were psychological, some were simply developmental, children who were growing more slowly than the program's timeline required, who might have become sufficient given more time, but were not given more time because time was a resource the program allocated carefully. Reading it, researchers noted, produced something quieter and colder than horror. It produced the feeling of looking at something that considered itself reasonable. Chapter 15, Vault 95. The Cache. Some of the most revealing Vault experiments were not the ones that introduced the most extreme conditions, but the ones that introduced the most precisely calibrated ones. Not a vault full of weapons or a dangerous organism, not a vault where governance was designed to fail from the start, but a vault where almost everything was fine, where the people were reasonable and the systems worked, and the community that formed was genuinely functional and warm. And then, at a specific moment, one thing changed. One thing the designers had always planned to change, placed there precisely because they wanted to see what happened when it did. Vault 95, located in the Commonwealth's southern territories, was that kind of experiment. In its early years, it was one of the most successful vaults in the network, and then it wasn't. The residents of Vault 95 were selected specifically from among people in recovery from addiction, individuals who had, prior to the Great War, struggled with dependency on various substances and who had sought and found treatment, who had built lives of sustained sobriety, who had developed the specific psychological tools that long-term recovery requires, the capacity for honest self-assessment, the willingness to ask for help, the ability to sit with discomfort without reaching for relief. The vault's designers had chosen this population for reasons that were, in themselves, almost admiring. Recovering addicts were among the most psychologically resilient populations available. They had already survived one kind of collapse and rebuilt themselves. They would, in theory, be exceptionally well equipped to handle the stresses of underground confinement. The community that formed in Vault 95 was remarkable by any measure. The shared experience of recovery created an immediate and genuine social bond. They understood each other in ways that randomly assembled communities often do not. They had the language of mutual support already built in. They held meetings. They checked on each other. When the pressures of confinement produced stress and despair, they had frameworks for processing it. One observer's log from the early years notes with what reads as genuine surprise. They were doing well. The overseer of Vault 95 knew what was in the sealed storage room on the vault's lower level. She had been given the key and the instructions along with her other administrative materials, sealed in an envelope marked for opening only at a specific date, a date still years away when she first received it. She did not open it early. She maintained the vault's routines, supported the community's recovery culture, documented the residents' remarkable psychological health. She knew what was coming. She did not tell anyone. The sealed storage room contained chems, a significant quantity, a carefully curated selection of the most addictive substances available in pre-war America, stored in pristine condition, waiting. This was the experiment, not the psychology of a community under stress, not governance challenges, not any variable that had been the focus of other Vault programs. This was an experiment about relapse, specifically about what happens to a community of people in long-term recovery when the substance they have been recovering from is suddenly, abundantly available. An agent had been placed in Vault 95 as a resident. He had a complete cover identity, a manufactured history of recovery, and detailed behavioral instructions. He had lived in the vault for years, participating fully in its community, becoming, by all accounts, a genuine and valued member of it. He was known as a reliable presence in the recovery meetings. He was trusted. When the date arrived and the overseer opened the envelope, the instructions were simple: unlock the storage room, inform the residents of its contents, make the cash available, and observe what followed. The overseer's log entry from that date is one of the most painful documents in the Vault archive. She writes briefly and without elaboration. She writes that she has followed the instructions. She writes that she is sorry. She does not specify to whom the apology is directed. She does not make another entry for 3 days. The community's response to the revelation of the cache was not uniform, and this is important to understand. The experiment's designers had perhaps imagined a simple collapse, a population of addicts confronted with their substance of choice, falling back into dependency with the momentum of biological imperative. What actually happened was more complicated and more human. Some residents refused entirely, immediately, and categorically. Some relapsed immediately with what the logs describe as a kind of relief that was almost indistinguishable from grief. Most fell somewhere between these poles, people who wanted to refuse and weren't sure they could, who watched their neighbors make choices and felt those choices pulling at something in themselves. The community's support structures were tested in ways they had not been designed for. The recovery meetings continued. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this in the logs, but their character changed. They were no longer meetings where everyone was committed to the same direction. They were meetings where people on different sides of a line that had been deliberately drawn through the community sat across from each other and tried to maintain something that the experiment was designed to destroy. It lasted longer than the designers had expected. The community was genuinely resilient, and the relationships formed over years of shared recovery did not dissolve immediately under pressure. People covered for each other. People intervened. The deterioration was slow and then fast, in the way these things always are, a long period of holding on followed by a much briefer period of letting go. The violence, when it came, did not come from the residents who had relapsed. It came from the residents who had not, who had watched their community disintegrate and who had identified the agent as the point of origin of what had been done to them. They were not wrong. He was. The confrontation was not abstract. The overseer survived the vault's collapse, barely and with significant injury, and made it to the surface years before explorers found Vault 95 in a state of near-total devastation. Her account of what had happened, given to followers of the Apocalypse outpost that treated her injuries, was the primary source of information about Vault 95 for many years. She described the community that had existed in those early years with an intensity of detail that suggested she had spent a great deal of time thinking about it. The meetings, the relationships, the particular atmosphere of a group of people who had each individually decided to be better and who had found, in that shared decision, something that felt like home. She described the envelope and what was in it. She described the look on the face of a woman she had considered a friend when the cache was revealed. A woman who had been sober for 11 years. She was asked by the follower's researcher recording her account whether she had considered refusing to follow the instructions, whether she had considered destroying the cache or warning the residents, or finding some way to subvert what was coming. She said she had considered it every day for the 3 years between receiving the envelope and the date written on it. She said she had told herself she was following protocol, doing her job, that the experiment had purposes she might not fully understand, that the researchers who designed it had reasons she was not in a position to second guess. She said she now understood that these were the same things people told themselves before doing almost every terrible thing that had ever been done. The vault was found with the cache still partially stocked. The remaining chems were destroyed. The overseer's testimony is filed in the follower's archive under a category the archivist created specifically for this document. The category is labeled Testimonies of Survival, with culpability. It is a small category. It contains some of the most important documents in the archive. Chapter 16, Vault 96, The Caretakers. Not every vault was built to study what human beings would do to each other under pressure. Some were built to study what human beings would do with responsibility, with the specific weight of being trusted with something that mattered, that could not advocate for itself, that depended entirely on the people assigned to protect it. Vault 96, located in the Appalachian Highlands of what had been West Virginia, was one of these. It was built around a mission that was, on its face, genuinely noble, to preserve the genetic material of every major animal species threatened by the coming war, so that the post-nuclear world could eventually be repopulated with something approaching ecological diversity. It was, in the language of its designers, an ark. The Noah's Ark framing was not incidental. The vault's designers used it deliberately, both in internal documentation and in materials given to residents. There was something psychologically useful, they had determined, about giving a population a mission that transcended their own survival, a purpose larger than themselves, a responsibility to something beyond the immediate community. People who believed they were the stewards of the world's biological heritage would be motivated differently than people who believed they were simply waiting out a catastrophe. The vault's residents were selected accordingly: wildlife biologists, veterinarians, zoologists, geneticists, ecologists, people whose professional lives had been devoted to the study and protection of animal species, who had the technical skills to manage a cryopreservation facility of significant complexity, and who had the emotional relationship to their subject matter that the designers believed would sustain motivation over the long haul. They were accustomed to working on behalf of something that did not know they were working on its behalf. The cryopreservation systems in Vault 96 were sophisticated even by pre-war standards. The vault housed genetic samples, frozen embryos, preserved tissue, stored DNA sequences from hundreds of species, ranging from apex predators to the insects and microorganisms that underpinned entire ecological systems. The scope of the collection was staggering. The residents understood that what they were protecting was not a collection of individual animals, but the possibility of a living world, the biological raw material from which, given time and stability and the right conditions, something like the pre-war ecosystem might eventually be reconstructed. This mission gave Vault 96's community a quality that differentiated it from most other vaults, a forward-looking orientation. Where other vault populations were consumed by how to survive the present, the residents of Vault 96 were oriented toward a future they would likely not live to see. They named animals in the cryobanks. They maintained detailed care logs as though the preserved embryos were living creatures in their charge. They argued about post-war ecological restoration strategies with the intensity of people planning a project they expected to complete. In the vault's early years, this sustained something that can accurately be called hope. The experiment's secondary component was not disclosed to the residents. Vault 96's designers were interested in a specific question: whether the presence of a transcendent mission would sustain social cohesion under conditions of extreme stress more effectively than other motivational frameworks. They had designed a series of escalating stressors into the vault systems, equipment that degraded slightly faster than it should, atmospheric fluctuations within the range of habitability, but beyond the range of comfort, resource calculations that came out slightly shorter than projected. Enough friction to create sustained pressure without triggering an obvious crisis. For many years, the mission held. The Vault's records from its middle decades document a community under real strain, the accumulating discomforts of long-term confinement, interpersonal friction, the specific exhaustion of maintaining complex systems without adequate replacement parts, but a community that remained oriented toward its purpose. The arguments were about restoration priorities, about which species to prioritize, about long-term ecological strategies. They were the arguments of people who still believed the project was going somewhere. The cryosystem failure, when it came, was not one of the designed stressors. It was a genuine malfunction, a cascading failure in the primary cooling infrastructure that had been slowly developing for years in a component the Vault's engineers had flagged for replacement, but been unable to source. The failure spread through the system faster than the residents could contain it. Sections of the cryobank maintained at stable temperatures for decades began to warm. The genetic material inside, irreplaceable and irreproducible, began to degrade. The response of Vault 96's residents to this crisis is documented in extraordinary detail because several kept personal logs during the emergency that survived the subsequent decades. What those logs describe is a community that did not collapse into recrimination or despair, but mobilized with a speed and coordination that surprised even its members. They saved most of it. Not all. The losses were significant, and some species whose samples were stored in the most severely affected sections were lost entirely. But the core of the collection survived, transferred to emergency backup systems with the organized desperation of people who understood exactly what they were saving and exactly what they were losing. The residents worked in shifts for 72 hours straight. There were injuries. There was one death, a veterinary technician named Mara, according to the logs, who was working in a section where a secondary coolant line ruptured. She is mentioned in every personal log from that period. The aftermath of the crisis was the most difficult period in Vault 96's history. The losses had been real, species that existed nowhere else, futures that had been foreclosed. Some residents grieved the lost species with an intensity that confused people who had not been living with them for decades. People for whom an extinct animal was an abstraction. For the residents of Vault 96, the extinct animals were entries in logs they had maintained, names they had given, futures they had planned. The grief was personal. The community recovered, as communities do. Not by returning to what it had been, but by becoming something that had incorporated its losses. The project had always been about imperfect preservation against impossible odds. The crisis had made this explicit in a way that the early optimism had obscured. They continued. The Vault's eventual opening was not dramatic. The third and fourth generation of descendants made contact with the outside world through radio signals and established communication with the Responders, a post-war faction operating in the Appalachian region. The negotiations for opening were careful and took months. The residents had specific concerns about the security of the cryo collection, about ensuring the genetic material would be protected and properly utilized. When the door finally opened, the outside world was not ready for what it received. The infrastructure for ecological restoration, stable territories, scientific institutions, the long-term planning capacity to actually use what the Vault had preserved did not yet exist at the required scale. The collection was distributed among several institutions for safekeeping, with the understanding that its full application was a project for a future generation. The residents of Vault 96 had known this might be the outcome. They had prepared for it by documenting everything: the conditions of preservation, the ecological data, the restoration plans developed over generations, the arguments about priorities and methods, and the long-term shape of the world they were trying to help rebuild. The documentation is extraordinary, not just in its technical detail, but in its emotional quality, in the evidence visible on every page of people who cared deeply and specifically about what they were doing and why. The caretakers of Vault 96 spent their lives, and their children's lives, and their children's children's lives in service of creatures that did not know they existed. The animals in the cryobank had no awareness of the emergency that had nearly ended everything, no understanding of the grief that followed the losses. They were simply preserved, frozen in the moment of their collection, waiting for a world that might or might not come. The residents knew this. They preserved the animals anyway, with the specific selfless quality of people who have made peace with doing important work that will never be witnessed by the ones they are doing it for. It is, in the long catalog of things the Vault's produced, one of the rarer ones. It is something that looks carefully examined, like genuine goodness. imperfect and bounded and achieved at real cost, but present. Actually present in the dark for generations. Keeping the lights on for a future that might never come because it was the right thing to do, and they had decided a very long time ago that this was who they were. The vaults are quiet now. The doors are open, most of them. The experiments are over, most of them. The people who designed them are gone, and the people who survived them built the world that came after, carrying everything that happened in the dark out into the light with them. That's what survivors do. That's what you do every day. Sleep now. The door is open. You can leave whenever you want.